the smell hits you first. Not the smell of a battlefield, not the iron bite of blood or the acrid choke of smoke, but something more mechanical, more intimate, the thick, oily perfume of diesel soaking into hot steel, baking in the Lithuanian summer heat, mingling with the sweat of 5 men crammed into a space barely large enough for 3. Inside the belly of this thing, this mountain of riveted armor plate, the air is barely breathable. The temperature climbs past 40 degrees. Every surface scorches the skin. The engine, 600 horses packed into a 12-cylinder block directly behind the crew compartment, vibrates at a frequency that does not just rattle the bones, but seems to reorganize them, to shake the calcium loose, to remind you constantly and without mercy that you are not a passenger inside this machine. You are part of it. And the machine, in the summer of 1941, on a dusty road carving through the flat, green heart of Lithuania, has decided to stop. Not because of a shell, not because of a bomb. The transmission, a notoriously brutal piece of engineering that demanded the strength of 2 men and the patience of a saint just to change gears, has finally given out. The KV-2, all 52 tons of it, sits motionless in the middle of the road, a roadblock made of history. Behind it, the retreating columns of the Red Army have already vanished eastward, swallowed by the dust and the panic of Barbarossa's opening days. Ahead, moving at the precise, efficient tempo of a Wehrmacht summer offensive, comes the full weight of the 6th Panzer Division. The commander of this stranded giant peers through his vision port. He can see dust clouds. He can count the shapes emerging from the haze. He does not reach for a white flag. He does not order his crew to abandon the vehicle. Instead, he traverses the enormous square turret, that ridiculous, magnificent cube of steel that makes the KV-2 look less like a tank and more like a mobile fortress until the barrel of the 152-millimeter howitzer is pointing directly down the road. Then he waits. What happens over the next 24 hours will pass into the folklore of the Second World War. A story so extreme, so cinematically improbable, that historians spent decades debating whether it really happened exactly as the German general who witnessed it described. But happen it did. And the machine at the center of it, this immovable, seemingly indestructible colossus, was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It was proof that 5 Soviet soldiers, stranded and surrounded, could hold an entire German division at bay through sheer mechanical stubbornness and human will. This is the story of the Battle of Raseiniai, of the ghost crew that no one remembers by name, and of the most terrifying tank the Wehrmacht had ever seen. To understand why the KV-2 was so shocking to the German soldiers who first encountered it in June of 1941, you have to understand what the Wehrmacht expected when it crossed the Soviet border. German intelligence, notoriously overconfident, notoriously dismissive of Soviet industrial and military capacity, had compiled assessments of Red Army armor that were, to put it generously, incomplete. The standard Soviet tank in most German reports was the BT series, a fast, lightly armored machine that German anti-tank guns could penetrate without difficulty. There were some mentions of heavier vehicles, the T-34 in particular, but even the T-34, which would go on to become perhaps the most important tank in the history of warfare, was not yet fully understood by German planners. What almost nobody in the Wehrmacht seriously believed they would encounter was something like the KV series. And nothing in the KV series was quite as alarming as the KV-2. The story of the KV-2 begins in the frozen hell of Finland in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940. The Red Army, which most outside observers had assumed would crush Finland in a matter of weeks, found itself in catastrophic difficulty. The Mannerheim Line, a network of concrete bunkers and fortified positions, was proving nearly impervious to standard Soviet assault tactics. Tanks were being stopped by anti-tank guns and artillery. Infantry assaults without adequate armored support were bleeding out in the snow. Someone in the Soviet military establishment, watching the carnage, decided what was needed was not a faster tank, not a more maneuverable tank, but a tank that could simply destroy a concrete fortification with a single shot. What was needed, in other words, was a tank that carried the kind of artillery piece normally found bolted to the ground, attached to the back of a lorry, or mounted on a warship. The result? Rushed into production with the desperate urgency that characterized Soviet wartime. Manufacturing at its best was the KV-2. The KV chassis itself, the Kliment Voroshilov, named after the Soviet defense commissar, was already an impressive piece of engineering. The KV-1, the standard heavy tank, was built around a hull with armor so thick that the standard German anti-tank cannon, the 37mm Pak 35/36, was essentially useless against it. German soldiers who encountered KV-1s during the opening weeks of Barbarossa called the Pak 35/36 the Heeres- and Klopfgerät, the army door knocker, because that was approximately how effective it was. The shells simply knocked on the armor and fell away, but the KV-2 took the already formidable KV-1 hull and placed on top of it the most absurd, the most impractical, the most brutally effective turret in the history of tank design. The turret was a great square box, roughly 2 meters tall, with walls up to 110 millimeters thick. It housed the MT-10 howitzer, a 152mm artillery piece firing shells that weighed close to 40 kilograms. A single round from this weapon, if it struck a Panzer III or a Panzer IV, the backbone of the German armored force in 1941, did not merely penetrate the armor. It obliterated the vehicle, turned it inside out, scattered it across the landscape in a radius of destruction that made every German tank commander who witnessed it revise his understanding of what a tank could do to another tank. The cost of this firepower was severe. 52 tons was an extraordinary weight for a vehicle of this era. The transmission, designed for a somewhat lighter load, was chronically overworked and prone to catastrophic failure. The enormous turret, which weighed roughly 12 tons on its own, was almost impossible to traverse on a slope because the mechanism relied on gravity, and if the vehicle was not on perfectly level ground, the turret would either refuse to move or swing wildly in ways the crew could not control. Loading the howitzer required a loader of exceptional strength. The shells were enormous, the charge bags were heavy, and the space inside the turret was cruelly inadequate for the task. The rate of fire was agonizingly slow. A well-drilled crew could manage perhaps 2 rounds per minute. The engine, for all its 600 horsepower, was siphoned and choked by the sheer mass it was expected to move, leaving the KV-2 with a top speed of around 25 kilometers per hour on a good road, and substantially less on anything else. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a monster, magnificent, terrifying, and deeply, almost lovably flawed. The first crews who trained on the KV-2 approached the vehicle with a mixture of awe and dread. The awe was obvious. Nothing in the Red Army arsenal came close to this level of protection and firepower. The dread was equally rational. The KV-2 had a reputation for mechanical treachery. Stories circulated among crews about transmissions that seized without warning, turrets that jammed at critical moments, engines that drank fuel at a prodigious rate, and still managed to overheat in summer conditions. The 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, lived in close and uncomfortable proximity to all these problems simultaneously. The driver sat at the front of the hull alone in his compartment, working the clutch and steering levers with arms that needed to be, over a long mission, more machine than flesh. The commander peered through his vision ports and cupola and tried to see a battlefield that the vehicle's own bulk made difficult to observe. The loader, perhaps the most physically punished member of the crew, spent his missions crouched and heaving in a space designed with no evident concern for his comfort, wrestling shells larger than his own torso. And yet these crews loved their machines. Not despite the flaws, but in some perverse way, because of them. A vehicle that demanded so much earned something in return. When the KV-2 worked, when the engine sang, when the gun loaded smoothly, when the armor did what it was designed to do and turned enemy fire into irrelevant noise, there was nothing else on the battlefield that made a crew feel so absolutely safe. Safe in the way that a medieval knight might have felt inside full plate armor, absurdly, triumphantly protected, daring the enemy to try harder, watching their best efforts rebound and fail. The Soviet crews of 1941 who took their KV-2s into battle were not naive. They knew the vehicle's weaknesses. They knew that a sufficiently large artillery piece, deployed correctly, could still destroy them. But they also knew that the Germans, in those first weeks of Barbarossa, did not have that artillery piece readily to hand, which meant that, in the right circumstances, a single KV-2 was effectively invincible. The summer of 1941 should have been a time of triumph for the Red Army's armored forces. On paper, the Soviet Union had more tanks than any other nation on Earth. Thousands of them spread across the western military districts, dug into positions and staging areas that should have given the defenders a significant advantage. In reality, the opening hours of Barbarossa stripped that advantage away with brutal efficiency. The Luftwaffe's strikes on Soviet airfields, conducted in the gray dawn of June the 22nd, destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground. The coordinated breakthrough attacks by 3 massive German army groups tore through Soviet defensive lines before commanders at every level had processed what was happening. Communications failed. Orders arrived too late, or not at all. Units were encircled before they had fired a shot. Divisions that should have been poised to counterattack found themselves retreating in disorder, or surrendering, or simply disappearing into the chaos. The 2nd Tank Division, part of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, was one of hundreds of Soviet formations that experienced this nightmare firsthand. Stationed in the Baltic Military District in Lithuania, it was ordered to counterattack the advancing German columns almost immediately after the invasion began, before it had time to concentrate, refuel, or properly coordinate. The result was a series of fragmented, piecemeal engagements that accomplished little except the destruction of Soviet equipment and personnel. Tanks broke down or ran out of fuel. Some crews abandoned their vehicles when mechanical failure made them immobile. Others were knocked out in ambushes or destroyed by Luftwaffe strikes on the roads. By the 24th of June, the division was in serious difficulty, conducting a fighting retreat eastward as the 6th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced and capable armored formations under the command of General Erhard Raus, pushed forward along the road toward Raseiniai. It was during this retreat that one KV-2 lost its transmission. The vehicle, already behind the main body of its unit, ground to a halt on a road that the German advance would shortly need to use. The options available to the crew were limited. They could abandon the tank and walk east. They could attempt a repair that, given the tools and time available, was essentially impossible. Or they could stay. Something, some combination of duty and stubbornness and perhaps sheer courage that defies easy categorization, made them choose the third option. The crew of this particular KV-2, their names unrecorded, their faces unknown, their individual histories swallowed by the chaos of the campaign, prepared to receive the entire 6th Panzer Division with approximately 40 rounds of 152mm ammunition, whatever small arms they carried, and the armor of their broken but still breathing machine. The morning of the 24th of June arrived with the particular clarity that summer mornings in the Baltic states can produce. A sharp light, a slight cool that would burn off by mid-morning, the smell of pine resin from the forests flanking the road. The first German elements to encounter the KV-2 were probably reconnaissance units, light armored vehicles that came around a bend or over a rise and found the enormous square turreted colossus blocking the road like a piece of street furniture placed there by a giant. What happened next was entirely predictable. The reconnaissance vehicles either retreated or were destroyed, and the information they relayed back through the chain of command reached General Raus with sufficient urgency to interrupt his schedule. Raus was not a man easily rattled. He had served in the First World War, had been part of the early development of German armored doctrine, and had enough practical experience to take most battlefield surprises in stride. But the reports coming from his forward units about this single tank blocking the road were, even by the standards of a campaign already full of surprises, remarkable. The vehicle was impervious to standard anti-tank fire. Every gun his forces had available, up to and including the standard 50mm anti-tank cannon that had been specifically introduced to deal with heavier armor, was bouncing its rounds off the KV-2's hull and turret without effect. The tank was not just surviving the attacks, it was responding to them. Each time a German unit attempted to push past it or destroy it, the great turret would swing slowly around. The howitzer would elevate or depress with almost contemptuous patience, and another German vehicle or another gun position would be turned into burning wreckage. Raus later wrote about this engagement in his memoirs with the kind of detail that suggests it lodged in his memory as one of the genuinely astonishing events of an astonishing war. He described how his forces tried one approach after another, each one defeated by the same combination of thick armor and powerful firepower. The infantry could not close with the tank because the crew, watching through their vision ports, could direct the howitzer with sufficient accuracy to destroy any concentration of men that attempted to approach on foot. The armor could not push past because the road was flanked by marshy ground that would swallow a tank trying to bypass the obstacle. And the artillery, the anti-tank artillery that would normally be the answer to a problem like this, was not yet forward enough to be brought to bear. What Raus described with particular vividness was a moment that has since become the most often cited episode of the entire engagement. His forces managed to bring forward a 50mm anti-tank gun, a significant piece of equipment, the best they had readily available, and position it at a range from which, against virtually any other target in the Soviet inventory, a kill would have been essentially guaranteed. The gun opened fire. Raus recalled how his soldiers, watching from their positions, cheered as they saw the rounds strike the KV-2's turret. They could hear the impacts even at distance, sharp, metallic reports, and they could see the flashes of the hits. For a moment, it seemed that perhaps this time the tank had been defeated. The firing stopped, the smoke cleared, and the KV-2's turret, moving with that slow, implacable patience that the Germans would come to find deeply disturbing, rotated until the howitzer was pointing directly at the gun position. A single round ended the celebration. The crew of the anti-tank gun was gone. The position was destroyed. The KV-2 sat in the road, unchanged, unmoved, apparently unharmed. This is the moment that makes the modern reader stop and think. Because in every war film, every historical narrative, there comes a point where the outcome is not yet decided, where the scale of what is happening still exceeds the ability of any participant to fully comprehend it. The German soldiers watching this tank absorb round after round and continue fighting were experiencing something that their training had not prepared them for. They were encountering a weapon system that violated their understanding of what was possible. And they were doing it in real time, with lives and time and strategic momentum all simultaneously at stake. What would you do trapped in that situation? You are a trained professional. You have equipment that should work, and none of it is working. What do you reach for when everything you know has failed? The crew inside the tank, meanwhile, was living through something no less extraordinary. 24 hours in a steel box on a summer day, without food, without water, without the ability to open any hatch without risking immediate death from the German infantry surrounding them. The temperature inside the vehicle, already brutal under normal conditions, must have been close to unbearable. The noise of incoming fire against the armor. And there was a lot of incoming fire. The Germans throwing every available weapon at the tank in repeated attempts to crack it would not have been abstract. Each impact, even when it failed to penetrate, transferred its energy into the hull, creating a concussive ringing that echoed and re-echoed inside the metal shell. Prolonged exposure to this kind of sound and vibration, combined with heat, dehydration, and the constant psychological pressure of being surrounded and hunted, degrades human function in ways that are well documented. The crew of this KV-2 endured all of it. What we know about their internal life during those 24 hours is almost nothing. We do not have their letters, their diaries, their post-war accounts. We do not know the commander's name, or whether he was young or old, a career soldier or a conscript, a man of deep political conviction, or someone who simply could not bring himself to abandon a machine he had been entrusted with. We do not know whether the crew argued about their situation, whether they prayed, whether they told each other stories or sat in silence. What we know is what they did. They kept loading. They kept firing. They kept turning the turret toward new threats as they appeared. When German engineers tried to approach the tank under cover of darkness, a desperate measure, using infantry to place explosive charges against the hull, the crew detected them, or heard them, or perhaps simply opened fire at random into the dark with their secondary armament, and the attempt failed. The KV-2 held. Through the night of the 24th and into the morning of the 25th, the engagement continued. The German supply columns that needed to use this road could not. The logistics of an entire armored division, the flow of fuel and ammunition and food that kept the 6th Panzer Division operational, was being disrupted by 5 men and a broken transmission. Raus was not a man who accepted this kind of delay with equanimity. Every hour the KV-2 held the road was an hour the Soviet forces had to deepen their defenses further east. Every hour was a calculation in momentum that the Wehrmacht's entire operational theory was built on maintaining. The Blitzkrieg was, at its core, a system built on speed, on the exploitation of paralysis, on moving through the gap before the enemy could organize a response. And here was a single tank, a single crew holding the gap shut. The solution, when it came, required the kind of improvisation that the Wehrmacht's junior leadership was often better at than any other army of the era. The Flak 88, the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, was the Wehrmacht's universal answer to problems that had no other solution. Originally designed to shoot down aircraft, the 88 had been discovered early in the war to have an extraordinary secondary role as an anti-tank weapon, capable of penetrating armor at ranges that made engagement safe for the gun crew. The problem was getting it into position. The KV-2's crew, if they could see the 88 being deployed, would simply destroy it before it could fire. The solution the Germans developed was a distraction, a coordinated attack by several Panzer tanks, driving toward the KV-2 from the front to hold the crew's attention, while a detachment of infantry and engineers worked to move the 88 into a flanking position under whatever cover the terrain afforded. This operation took time to organize and more time to execute, but eventually it succeeded. The 88 was positioned. The diversionary attack commenced. The KV-2's crew, focused on the frontal threat, did not immediately register the new danger. The 88 opened fire. The first round struck the KV-2 in a location that, unlike the hits from every previous weapon, did not simply rebound. The shell penetrated. There was an internal explosion. The tank, which had been firing, stopped firing. The turret, which had been traversing, stopped traversing. The engine, which had been sending its permanent tremor through the hull and the earth and the feet of every German soldier standing near enough to feel it, went quiet. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the 6th Panzer Division had its road back. But the German soldiers who approached the KV-2, approaching carefully, because you did not approach a KV-2 without caution, regardless of how destroyed it appeared, found something unexpected. The vehicle had been hit multiple times. The 88mm rounds had done their work, but the majority of the earlier hits, the dozens and dozens of rounds from every weapon the Germans had available in those 24 hours, had left marks that were testimony to the armor's quality. Dents, gouges, impact craters in the surface of the steel, but no penetrations. The vehicle had been, for all practical purposes, impenetrable to everything except that one specific weapon used in that specific way. And inside the tank, or near it, were the crew, or what remained of them. They were dead, of course, but the manner of their end was such that the German soldiers standing around the wrecked KV-2 on the morning of June the 25th did something that was, in the context of Operation Barbarossa, genuinely unusual. They were quiet. Erhard Raus, who had every professional reason to be angry about the 24-hour delay this single crew had imposed on his division, and who had watched his men killed and his guns destroyed throughout the engagement, described the moment in his memoirs with something approaching reverence. He did not minimize the operational cost. The disruption had been significant, and in the mathematics of a campaign running on tight margins of time and supply, every lost hour mattered. But he also could not deny what he had witnessed. These 5 men, stranded and immobile, had held his entire division at bay for a full day. They had absorbed everything he could throw at them, killed an unknown number of his soldiers, destroyed vehicles and guns, and done it all without any prospect of rescue, resupply, or relief. They had done it because they chose to. And at the end of it, German soldiers who had spent 24 hours trying to kill them stood over their bodies and honored their courage. There is a detail in some accounts of Raseiniai that carries an almost unbearable weight of specificity. When the German soldiers finally approached the KV-2 after it had been silenced, Some of them noticed that the vehicle's hull had been struck by a supply column's truck at some point during the engagement, whether by accident or in one of the desperate German attempts to do something, anything, about the obstacle. The mark of the truck was there on the armor alongside all the other impacts, and beside it the scratch marks of small arms and the craters left by shells that had simply refused to penetrate. It is an image that condenses something important about the nature of this particular battle. The massive industrial violence being directed at this one vehicle, and the vehicle absorbing it all, holding it, turning it back. What does it mean that we do not know the names of the crew? Military historians have tried to establish their identities, going through the records of the 2nd Tank Division that survived the catastrophic destruction of that formation in 1941. The records are incomplete, as the records of almost every Soviet unit in the first weeks of Barbarossa are incomplete, because the units themselves were being destroyed faster than any administrative system could track. The 5 men inside that KV-2 may have enlisted as young volunteers, full of revolutionary enthusiasm, or been conscripted from the collective farms of Ukraine or the factories of the Urals, or been career officers who had come up through the ranks of the mechanized corps. We will almost certainly never know. What we know is the fact of their decision, and the fact of their stand, and the extraordinary mechanical achievement of the machine that made their stand possible. The KV-2 at Raseiniai was not the only heavy Soviet tank to surprise the Wehrmacht in those first weeks of Barbarossa. Across the front, German tank crews and anti-tank crews encountered KV-1s and KV-2s and T-34s and were forced to improvise solutions to a problem their training had not prepared them for. The first encounters with the T-34 produced similar reports of standard anti-tank rounds deflecting off sloped armor. The Panzer IV, which was supposed to be the heaviest tank in the German inventory, found itself outmatched in terms of protection by vehicles it was supposed to be able to destroy. The entire German anti-tank doctrine of 1941, built around the assumption of relatively thin armor and medium calibers, had to be rethought in real time under combat conditions. The improvised use of the 88mm flak gun as an anti-tank weapon, which became so standard later in the war that most people think of it as an original intention rather than an emergency measure, was largely a product of these first encounters with Soviet heavy armor. But the KV-2 at Raseiniai holds a particular place in this story because of its isolation, its stillness, and the duration of the engagement. Most encounters between German units and Soviet heavy tanks in 1941 were brief, chaotic affairs, a meeting engagement on a road, a confused melee at a crossroads, a quick ambush and withdrawal. They lasted minutes, not hours. The Raseiniai engagement lasted a full day and a night. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. There was no maneuver, no flanking movement, no exploitation of ground. It was, instead, a test of endurance, the endurance of armor, and the endurance of the men inside it, conducted on a single fixed point of ground while an entire division reorganized its approach around the immovable obstacle of one broken-down tank and its 5-man crew. Think about what the German soldiers who eventually bypassed the KV-2 or waited for it to be dealt with experienced during those hours. They could hear it firing. They could hear the impacts of their own rounds against its armor. They could see the burning wrecks of their vehicles, and they could do almost nothing about it. The psychological effect of encountering a weapon system that appears to be invulnerable is not simply a matter of tactical inconvenience. It reaches into something deeper. into the sense of safety and competence that a soldier depends on to function. The German soldiers at Raseiniai were not cowards. The Wehrmacht in 1941 was, by any objective measure, a highly effective fighting force, full of well-trained professionals. But they spent 24 hours feeling, in a way that no amount of training can fully prepare you for, helpless. And at the end of those 24 hours, the vehicle responsible for that helplessness had been destroyed, and yet the crew responsible for it had done something that could not be dismissed or denied. They had simply refused to stop. There is a question worth sitting with here. In what sense was the KV-2 at Raseiniai a success or a failure? In the narrowest operational sense, it achieved nothing. The 2nd Tank Division was still retreating. The 6th Panzer Division was still advancing. The crew was dead. The tank was destroyed. The road was open, and within hours or days the German advance would continue, and within weeks Raseiniai itself would be deep in German-occupied territory. If you are measuring by territory held or objectives achieved, the engagement was a total Soviet loss. But if you measure by some other metric, by the ratio of effect to means, by the demonstration of what one crew with one vehicle could do to one of the Wehrmacht's premier divisions, by the sheer defiant refusal to concede that a broken transmission made surrender inevitable, then the calculation looks different. The crew of the K-2 at Raseiniai did not stop the German advance, but they made a division of German soldiers remember that the people they were fighting were not simply going to step aside. The KV-2 itself did not survive long as a major factor in Soviet armored operations. The type's mechanical problems, always severe, were exacerbated by the conditions of the 1941 campaign. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. The specialized ammunition for the 152mm howitzer was difficult to supply in the fluid, chaotic conditions of a retreat. Many KV-2s were abandoned for lack of fuel or parts rather than destroyed by enemy fire. Production of the type was already slowing by the time of Barbarossa, as Soviet planners recognized that the KV-1, simpler, lighter, with a more practical armament, was a better balance of characteristics for the kind of war they were actually fighting. The KV-2 was, in the end, a specialized instrument designed for a specific problem. The concrete bunkers of the Mannerheim Line and the general war that had erupted across the Eastern Front did not always play to its strengths, but the legend of the KV-2 at Raseiniai grew rather than faded. Part of this was due to Raus himself, who wrote about the engagement with a vividness and specificity that preserved the story in a form historians could work with. Part of it was the growing recognition, as the war continued and the scale of Soviet sacrifice became undeniable, that the opening weeks of Barbarossa had contained within them stories of resistance that deserved to be told alongside the catastrophes and surrenders that those weeks were better known for. The crew of the KV-2 became, in Soviet memory, a symbol of the kind of individual defiance that the official narrative of heroic collective resistance could sometimes obscure. Not a division holding a line, not a corps conducting a planned counterattack, but 5 men who had decided that here, on this road, on this day, they would not move. The physical evidence of the engagement, the tank itself, did not survive the war in any preserved form. The wreck was presumably salvaged, either by the Germans for scrap metal or by Soviet forces when they eventually pushed back through Lithuania in 1944. No one appears to have preserved it, photographed it extensively, or marked its location with any permanence. The battle site at Raseiniai is now a quiet stretch of Lithuanian road that bears no immediate visual testimony to what happened there. There may be nothing left of the specific vehicle, no remaining rivet or plate of armor that can be definitively identified. The tank exists now entirely as a story, preserved in the pages of Rouse's memoirs and the subsequent investigations of historians who have tried to establish exactly what happened and when. That absence of physical evidence is, in its own way, part of the story's meaning. The KV-2 at Raseiniai was not preserved as a trophy or a monument. It was consumed by the same war that consumed its crew. What remains is not the object, but the event, not the machine, but what the machine and its crew together accomplished and endured. And perhaps that is appropriate, because the most important thing about the engagement at Raseiniai was never the steel. Steel can be melted down and recast. The most important thing was the decision made by a commander, whose name we do not know, in a vehicle with a broken transmission, surrounded by an enemy division with no prospect of survival and every rational reason to surrender. The decision was not to surrender, and the vehicle, that preposterous, magnificent 52-ton monument to Soviet engineering ambition, held long enough to make the decision matter. There is something in the human relationship with machines that this story illuminates in a particular way. We often talk about weapons technology as if it exists separately from the people who use it, as if the capabilities of a tank or an aircraft or a ship can be understood independently of the men and women who maintain it, repair it, and ultimately decide what it will be used for. The KV-2 at Raseiniai was, technically, non-functional. Its transmission was gone. It could not move. By any reasonable definition, it was a disabled vehicle waiting to be recovered or destroyed, and yet because its crew chose to treat it as a fighting position rather than a coffin, it functioned as one of the most effective individual tank deployments in the history of the Second World War. The capabilities of the machine were fully realized only because the crew decided they would be. Without that decision, the KV-2 was just 52 tons of immobile steel. With it, it was something that a German general wrote about 50 years later with unmistakable respect. There is a final detail worth mentioning before we close this story. In the accounts of the engagement, several German witnesses describe how, after the KV-2 had finally been silenced, and the German soldiers approached it, some of them gathered around the wreck in a way that was unusual for the brutality of the Eastern Front in 1941. They did not loot it, or rather whatever looting may have occurred was secondary to an earlier, more instinctive response. They stood and looked. Rouse noted that even men who had lost friends and comrades to this tank over the previous 24 hours found themselves acknowledging something about the crew inside. These were the enemy. These were men who, had the situation been reversed, would have been trying to kill the German soldiers standing over their destroyed vehicle. None of that changed. But in that moment, on that road, in the dust and the heat of a Lithuanian summer morning, the men who had finally ended the siege of the KV-2 at Raseiniai understood that they had encountered something that exceeded the normal calculations of tactics and strategy. They had encountered courage of an uncommon kind, expressed through the medium of a machine that had been asked to hold a road and had held it. History is full of famous last stands: Thermopylae, the Alamo, the Brest Fortress. These are the stands we remember because they have names, because the commanders and many of the defenders have been preserved in records and monuments and national mythologies. The last stand of the KV-2 at Raseiniai does not quite fit that category. We do not know who they were. We cannot visit a monument to them, or read their letters, or look at their photographs. We have only the event itself, passed down through the enemy's memoirs, confirmed by the physics of armor and projectile, one of those small, precise, nearly anonymous acts of defiance that the Second World War scattered across its 6 terrible years in quantities that human memory has never quite managed to fully account for. But they held. For 24 hours in a broken machine, in impossible conditions, against an entire division, they held. And when you think about what it means to be human in an extreme situation, to choose resistance over surrender not because you have been ordered to, not because there is any realistic hope of survival, but simply because that is what you are going to do. When you think about that, the fact that we do not know their names becomes almost secondary. They did it. The machine, for all its flaws and all its mechanical stubbornness, held with them. And somewhere in Lithuania, on a quiet road that now shows no sign of what happened there, the ground still holds whatever traces remain of the last engagement, of the most remarkable single tank in the most devastating war in human history. Before you close this video, I want to ask you something. Think about the moment the commander of that crew looked through his vision port and saw the dust clouds of the 6th Panzer Division coming down the road. He knew his transmission was gone. He knew he could not move. He knew what was coming. And he chose to stay. What would you have done in that position? Not the noble version, not the version you tell yourself in calm moments, but the real version, in the heat and the noise and the absolute certainty that what was coming down that road was going to try very hard to kill you. Write it in the comments, because understanding that question, sitting honestly with it, is part of what it means to understand what happened at Raseiniai on the 24th of June, 1941. And if this story meant something to you, if the ghost crew of the KV-2 deserves to be remembered by more people, then share this video, because the only monument they have is the story itself. They held the road. The least we can do is hold the story. I'm John, and I thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I'll see you in the next video.